Okay, well, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Williams and I look after the Oxford, Cambridge and Cardiff programmes for the Institute. So today I'm going to be talking about great expectations, mentoring high ability students. So study abroad has always struck me as being rather an odd thing to do. And I say this as a very proud study abroader myself, because I spent a year abroad in France as part of my degree. And I use the word odd because quite literally, you pack up your bag and you head off to climates new and you don't know anyone. It's all just a little bit strange and you get to reinvent the you because the you that goes abroad and lives abroad is often quite different from the you that actually went abroad at the very, very beginning. So as I said, it can all be just a little bit odd because you're free of all of the expectations and narratives that you were subject to at home. And so those we's of me and navigating those we's of me can often be a little bit challenging. And I chose the title Great Expectations because it struck me that the plurality of cells and narratives that our students are subject is something that sort of Charles Dickens addresses in that book, because Pip, its hero, has to contend with some rather unpleasant consequences when he realizes that his rise through English society wasn't funded by the respectable Mrs. Havisham, but the rather low-class criminal Magwitch. So all of his assumptions about who he was and how he got where he got to be are rather proved to be wrong. And it just struck me that some of our students have a similar moment when they arrive in Oxford and all of their assumptions about Oxford and their role at Oxford and their life and how they're going to be embraced by Oxford and taken to its heart like Rob Lowe was in a hideous film called Oxford Blue, don't often match up to the reality. And it's at that moment then that I find that some of them then turn to a mentor for support. I should have asked how you... Oh, yes. Okay, there we are. So, yes, assumptions versus reality. So I think I should start off by giving you a sense of the typical IFSA Oxford student. All of them seem to come from very good colleges. They all have very good GPAs. They're usually highly articulate. They're intelligent, self-aware, nicely ambitious, and socially conscious. In fact, they're everything that a country needs its youth to be if that country is to be successful. They're also high achieving. And, that can sometimes have a very bad effect upon my ego. Sometimes I go home on the train after a day listening to these students telling me all the things they're doing, and I'm like, right, so I'm in my 50s, and I've done this, and they're barely in their 20s, and they've done that. So to give you a few examples, we have a student there now from Wake Forest who has stayed on for 6 extra weeks to do a research with a company there, and she's doing computer imaging of the AIDS virus, and I can barely send an email. And I'm listening there, and I'm like, oh, inadequate. We had some student last year who was part of the Oxford consultancy group, who ended up leading a group of students and bankers to Palestine, to the occupied territories there, to work out how to give microloans to women to improve the economy of that part of the world. And we have 2 students now who stayed on in Oxford. They were acting in a play, and the play was applied and accepted, and they're heading off for 3 weeks to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival to act in their play for the next 3 weeks. So, I go home feeling, yeah, I'm so wonderful about myself. So, anyway, okay. So yes, typical Oxford student, very high achieving. So, but I would say that these high achieving students, they do face some challenges. So firstly, I would say that, they have to acquire local knowledge that will help them maximise the value of their time at Oxford. Knowledge that their British peers automatically have, in Britain we're all steeped in the mythos of Oxford and what it can do for one's future. So to give you an example, since the blonde bombshell was elected in Britain 2 days ago as our Prime Minister, it means that 5 of the past 7 Prime Ministers in Britain have all been educated at Oxford. So it really does sort of educate the elite of our country. The second thing I would say is that a lot of them have become acclimatized to being seen by their peer group as being high achieving. And they quite enjoy that perception, actually, So a lot of their self-worth is caught up with this identity. So sort of what happens to it then, to this self-worth, when they go abroad and their academic landscape changes. And then I'd say the last challenge they have to deal with is that a lot of these students maybe don't see themselves as needing a mentor, and nor are they seen by other people as needing a mentor, because, they come to all the pre-departure meetings and they handed their forms in on time, and, they come to the orientation, they don't pretend they didn't know it was happening, and they seem organised and decisive, and, they also seem intellectually literate and confident. So, the role of the mentor, which would be me. So I would say that the first of these challenges I mentioned was that of local knowledge. So I think one of the most important parts of being a mentor, in a way, is proving one's worth, because I think the very least you can do if you expect people to listen to you is to make sure that what you're saying is worth listening to. So one of the ways I do this is to talk to the current students about what the past students have done and achieved at Oxford, because I think this exemplifies the potential that Oxford University has to sort of echo into their future selves in a very, very immediate way. But it also conveys, and I think in a very manageable sense, what a student can achieve at Oxford. Because it isn't me telling them what you can do, it's me telling them what their peers in the past have already achieved. And I think from this end, the students start to feel confident and to consider what they as individuals may want to do, but not by copying what other students have done, but by using this knowledge and these examples as a starting point for their own journey of self-discovery. And I think it's a journey that begins with me listening to them, talking about their hopes and fears for their future. So I think as a mentor, I think you have to start off by encouraging them about chatting to them and getting them to think about who they are and what they want to do in their future, and then to consider the ways that they can do what they can do at Oxford to help this future become more attainable. And then I would say the other challenge I mentioned was about self-worth. So the students have to learn to engage very quickly with the Oxford tutorial system. And thankfully, the narrative around that is often not as bad as its actuality. That said, however, it still takes an awful lot of grit and courage and determination to sit alone in a room with your tutor and to read out one's essay, then to defend the position you took in that essay for about an hour or so, while said tutor is trying to unpick it in a constructive manner. So that does take a lot of courage. And while the majority of students, they seem to rise to the occasion quite quickly, there are always a few who it takes a little bit longer for them to adjust their study habits and things like that. So when that happens, I usually meet with them and we discuss the issues that he or she is having. And they usually revolve around the amount of reading that they've done. There was this poor lad last term who read, and then he read and he read and he read. And then he read a bit more, and then he read some more again, and then he read and he read and he read. And then he had to write his paper, and he just could not synthesize all that he had read. So he ended up not handing in an essay that term, and we had a bit of an emotional chat together about all of that. So I was encouraging him to go and see the librarian and talk to the librarian about the most relevant books and articles, and try to sort of control your reading before you actually start doing the reading. And another good thing is, I always tell them to do, is to go to the library and try and find the perfect Oxford essay, take it out, then deconstruct it, so that they have a sense then of what they have to do in order to write a good essay. So again, I think the key to being a good mentor is to reassure while explaining what is required and how they can adjust their study habits so they can succeed. I also think another good thing to do as a mentor is to share a moment of your own pain from your own study abroad experience. I went to France, and I remember having practice, because I was still translating English to French at the time before I spoke, practice what I was going to say when I went to sign up for my class, and I stood there and said my French very haltingly. And this woman said, "Il faut parler, Madame Brachanga de Manga." And I'm like, what the was that? Panic on my face. So She then did that thing that I thought only the English do, which is to look at you like you're a bit special and to talk louder and more slower. And it took me months to work out that what she was telling me was to come back tomorrow and speak to Madame Brochin. I'm like, oh, okay. So the students enjoy hearing your own pain when they're studying abroad. I think, I'm not sure what slide I'm on now. Anyway, academic self-worth is also tied to the last topic I mentioned, which is not needing a mentor. So the Times Higher Education World University Rankings has ranked Oxford University as the #1 university in the world for the previous 3 years. So it means that one of the first things our students have to engage with at Oxford is that their home college isn't #1. Therefore, by implication, I may not be #1, and then they have to kind of work with the idea that they may be a slightly smaller fish in a slightly bigger pond than they are used to. And I think this can be fairly unsettling to them as people. So part of my role as a mentor is to be aware of the impact that this may have on them, and then to help them navigate this. So I do this again by chatting with them about their hopes and concerns for Oxford, and to get them to talk about their expectations, and then to unpack with them how many of these expectations are their own, or how many have been foisted upon them by their parents or a homeschool advisor or their peers, etc. And then we discuss how they can navigate their own path through them, deciding what they like and want to keep or what they want to discard. But I find that as soon as we start to chat about Oxford and its clubs and its societies and the student body and the visiting speakers and what previous students have achieved, the students suddenly realise just how much potential there is for Oxford to echo into their future self in a very beneficial way. And I think this realisation not only forms the basis of the ensuing relationship between the student and me, which I think has to be based upon the idea of mutual respect in a sense that each person will learn something from the other, but it also introduces the notion that the students may indeed, after all, need a mentor, not because, I'm a bit thick, but because things are different here, they do things differently, and there's a great potential here for my future, so I need somebody to educate me in the way that all the English degree-seeking students know before they arrive. So I would say that a successful mentor will create a space for each student to discover what they want to achieve in this new academic environment and how it can develop their scholarship. I think a mentor should also encourage the student to realise that they can challenge themselves beyond the academic. So one of the best ways that I have to do this is by using the rather excellent learning plan that IFSA now uses, yay academic affairs. And I think it really is, I find it to be an absolutely imperative tool to me doing a good job. I would say that traditionally academic students sometimes struggle to contemplate no academic goals. So the learning plan gets them to start to think about what do I want to do, how can I do it, how can my relationship with Andrew, mentor-mentee role, what can we do to make this work? The initial goals may be fairly abstract, so it's important to turn the abstract into the tangible, which again we do by chatting about, possible extracurricular activities that he or she might want to do while they're at Oxford, and in fact they could be sort of around but not limited to their areas of interest. I think the learning plan also helps the students to consider their study abroad experience in a more intentional way, and I have found that the more intentional a student is about their sort of experience abroad, the better it usually is. I think it also helps them to take ownership of their own experience, to make it theirs rather than a reflection of the expectations and narratives that they may have been subject to back home. I think the learning plan, most importantly, it helps me listen, and it's been my experience in life that most people need a good listening to rather than a good talking to. And a narrative also implies a reader or a listener, someone who can be a sounding board while one creates a narrative that is as close to oneself as one hopes it can be. And it really is a privilege, and I think it's the most pleasurable part of my job that for a brief time I'm able to mentor some truly amazing young people. Thank you very much.